waiting for it. Okay. Now, like I talked about in the previous episode, when you just finish on a song, okay, and then you're basically starting from scratch on the next one. You have to start sort of the whole thing again. You're starting with the kick, you're starting on the snares, and you're building up. It doesn't really work. What I find works is when you sort of do that sort of vinyl break and you go into a verse of another song. Okay, so you're not starting from 100% from the beginning, you're starting from a verse. So you're starting from a vocal point that helps grab the mix back. And that's what I feel saves the mix here. So we allow that pause to happen and then we bring it back in, we're sort of releasing it back in. We allow that very melodic, and the synths, the kick, and now the vocals are gonna come in. You know how we talked about in the last episode about pauses, and I was being very anal about, how having a pause is like, you gotta be careful with that, blah, blah, blah. Well, we're gonna flip all of that on its head. Yeah, so I want you to take everything that we've done with a grain of salt and always question and always be willing to flip it on their head or push these sort of so-called rules or sort of boundaries that we put on ourselves. You always want to break that. So even though I said that in the last episode, I was very sort of, paused, I did say that we also have exemptions. There's always ways that you can work with something like that, but you have to be very creative about it. In this example, we have a select amount of sort of these key pause moments. We're gonna see how powerful they can be and how dangerous they can be when you're doing a mix. I think that we've done a pretty good job at continuing the mix, but I'm gonna show you key points where you can almost just lose it if you're not careful. Creating pauses is a very great tool to use in your arsenal of mixing, but it can also be very tricky to deal with. So let me press record. Let's have a look.
Oh, I just hate being without you. It's just another thing to break through.
Okay, this is something we'll get into in a second, but I just want to really just focus in on those sort of pause moments to talk about them, and then we'll come back to what I want to share about the other parts. Okay. So you see how we just stop, right? And we're back in that silence. Okay. Now imagine if we're dancing, okay? I'm gonna mimic dancing. And we're building and like, yeah. Now, for me, looking at it from an emotional perspective, having a high level of emotional intelligence, I feel, is your strength in these situations. When we have those kind of moments where there's sort of like, it's almost like a false sort of build, and we're creating this build against anticipation, and then just, and you always have this sense of sadness, if you will. Bear with me. You can work with that And what I mean by that is you can approach it from adding a very emotional piece next to it. Okay, and I find that when you are approaching these sort of pause transitions, what I like to do is work with very progressive melodic music, very emotional music, and that helps soothe out those moments. Okay, so you have these very sort of energetic builds, and then you almost have this false sort of build. There's no sort of answer, and that can be a bit sort of like, you know? And to mellow that out, we give a bit of, a very soft melodic piece to go with it. And that sort of keeps that pot boiling, and it keeps the tension. At least from my perspective, that's the way I am thinking about it. You can be like, you are completely bonkers. But that's just the way I'm thinking about it. Okay, and your perspective could be completely different, and that's fine. You might have a completely different approach to it. I'm just sharing with you my thought process and the way I'm approaching using these sort of pause moments. Okay, so let's look at it again. And you're waiting for it. Now, like I talked about in the previous episode, when you just finish on a song, okay, and then you're basically starting from scratch on the next one, you have to start sort of the whole thing again. You're starting with the kick, you're starting on the snares, and you're building up. It doesn't really work. What I find works is when you sort of do that sort of vinyl break and you go into a verse of another song. Okay, so you're not starting from 100% from the beginning, you're starting from a verse, so you're starting from a vocal point that helps grab the mix back. And that's what I feel saves the mix here. So we allow that pause to happen, and then we bring it back in, we're sort of releasing it back in. We allow that very melodic, and the synths, the kick, and now the vocals are going to come in.
I'm in the dark, I'm underwater, searching for a teardrop in the water.
Cool. Now let's go over to the next one. I believe it is about here. Cool. So we have one where we've created this sort of false negative. We've created that sort of false build. We've stopped or bringing in this very emotional, melodic, progressive sort of piece, and it's coming through. It's building. Okay, and now we are again building.
Evidence again.
But it's very short, okay? So we're not putting the audience through another sort of big build, because if we do that, then it really has to be a big sort of transition. It has to be like almost like a big room or a completely different genre of music that's heavy, that's going to hold its own weight to do something like that. So you can create another massive build, but it's really, you gotta have a piece that's going to hold its own weight. And in something like this, to do that and then go into like a sort of very progressive house sort of chorus or drop, I don't think it really works. Sometimes it does, but I think you need something a little heavier. So we've created a little bit of a shorter build here.
And with us, our blood, our love.
Cool. So the synth leads come in for this main sort of chorus section of the song. And that's when I know, okay, cool, now this is where I want to transition. So we're adding effects onto that, showing that, so giving a signal that something's about to change. And then we cut. allow that effect tail to come in, so you can hear the cut. We allow the effect tail to come in, it expands out, and then we bring in the next song. And what I've selected is a song that's progressing. Okay, Hans Zimmer is an absolute master at this. You can hear there in Dunkirk, the soundtrack for Dunkirk, when it's just, I can't remember the exact musical terminology for this, but essentially what he's doing, he's able to make the sort of continuation of the cycle repeat indefinitely. Okay, so what I mean is that the tension is just continuous. There's a great video I watched a few years ago about this. If you look up Dunkirk, the behind the scenes or the breakdown of Dunkirk, it talks about, you know, creating this musical relationship, and essentially you're creating this tension, but it's just indefinitely looping, and it's just building and building and building and building. It never really has an end to it, and that's what's happening in this sort of song. So we've created this, you know, pause, and then again we're creating this tension. So it's similar to the aspects that we talked about in the previous one, creating these pockets of tension with these sort of pauses now. So we've created one, and then we'll create the next one. You can see how I'm approaching things, how we're sort of, you know, in these sections, creating these little miniature sort of build-ups, okay? So we created one longer build, okay? And then we've created this pause, brought in an emotional song. Again, we're compacting that tension, compacting that hype all into this, and we're continuing that, okay? Now we create a short little build, again, working with that tension, okay? And then we, again, have another sort of pause, and then we switch into the next song. Now this song is then again continuing building it up. It doesn't really have its own sort of resolve. It's continuing giving that answer. So throughout this whole section, we're giving the call we're never really having a resolve in the scene. There's not a resolving moment in the current time frame. We're just continually building and hyping, okay? So again, it's a melody that it's never resolving. It's continually going in circles and circles and building and building and building and building, and we're moving it, building and building and building and building until we finally give it release. And for me, in my perspective, it's not really an answer. It's not really the drop. It's just a continuation of what's been happening. We're building up that tension, but we're amping up the energy. We're amping up the beat. We're adding the kicks. We're building up to what we want to do. We're building up to that resolve. Okay? So that's one way where we can flip things on it. We can flip things on its head. I think that that's a very key thing to be willing to do. Is that, you know, even if I feel strongly about, you know, when these sort of pause moments should be put in, never should that be ingrained in, okay, that's, you know, don't do that. You know, always be willing to try it out and flip it on its head. You know, everything we've talked about, be willing to flip it on its head and try. You know, if I've mentioned something that's like, oh, maybe try, you know, flip it on its head and try doing the, you know, the complete opposite, just because, you know, something might not, you know, be the best practice. You know, just give it a shot. You know, one example is, you know, the dubstep we mentioned, and how I talked about, you know, being careful with, you know, pushing the limits. You know, it had its own sound. So even though I do feel strongly about certain things, you know, you always be willing to give it its own sort of space and time for you to see what you like. And if you like your music pinning at -4 LUFS, then cool, you know, that's your thing. And if you like your music to have, you know, more dynamics and stuff like that, awesome. If you like your music to have a bit of both, cool. What I'm saying is, take what I say and you put your own perspective on things and try it out, and then say, oh, okay, cool. I agree with this, but I still don't agree with that. And awesome. That's what I want to emphasize here. I think that's really key. That's really important.